welcome back to the final week of a Wild Flight mystery quilt brought to you by me, Lindsay from Wilde and Purdy. I'm so excited that you are here and you have made it to the final week where we are putting this quilt together. I wanted to say thank you for joining me on this journey. This has been my first ever mystery quilt. I know there have been a few hiccups along the way, but I have learned a ton from all of you and from this process on what to do differently next time. So I thoroughly hope that you've enjoyed your time with us, and be on the lookout next year where I do this again in January 2025. So without further ado, here's how to assemble the last week of a Wild Flight mystery quilt.
Step one in assembling our mystery quilt this week is starting with our formation block and block number 1 from our skein week. And we are going to sew these two together along this seam. When you do this, make sure that your flying geese are pointing to the upper right direction. You're going to want to make sure that is true for the formation blocks for this quilt and for the altitude blocks. Everything will point towards the upper right. It will not be true of all of the skein blocks, so just really focus on the formation blocks and the low altitude and high altitude blocks when we're assembling this week. I'm going to go sew this seam together and I'll be right back. Okay, I've sewn my geese formation block with my block number 1 right here. So these are sewn together at this seam. I'm going to set this aside for right now. And here you'll notice that I have block number 2 and block number 3 in front of me. I'm going to sew them together so that all of the, it depends on which way you want to look at it, all of my accent pieces are pointing down, and all of my, I forget what color this is, but this color is all pointing in that direction for both blocks. So I'm basically making a big, huge triangle out of these two blocks. Follow the orientation and the directions and you guys will be just fine. So I'm going to sew these together. Okay, you'll notice I have just sewn together the two blocks, block 2 and block 3 together, and now I am going to sew along this seam to the geese formation block that we just put together in the last step. So I'm going to sew right along here to make this one big panel. Okay, now that we have sewn these together, we're going to set this panel aside and we're going to work on the opposite panel. So we can just set this aside for a moment, and we are going to grab our next formation block. And again, you'll notice my flying geese are pointing to the upper right, and I'm going to take block number 2 and I am going to sew it on to the left side of my geese formation block like so. I lied. See, this is why we watch the instructions. Like so. So it'll go like this. Make sure you get that orientation correct. Otherwise I would have had to rip that out and that would not have made me happy, but it's not the first time Jack and I would have gone on a date. So go ahead and sew your geese formation block to block number 2 along this seam. So I'll get that ready to go. And then we're also going to sew block number 4 to block number 1 like so. And we're going to sew these two together down the center very similarly to what we just did. Okay, I have those pieces sewn together, and we're going to do like we did in the last section and sew them together along this seam line, and then we'll have our second panel created. There we have it. We have our second panel put together. So now we can move on to the next step, which, if you're following along in the instructions, is page 28, where we are going to add our wind blocks. Okay, so now we have sewn both of these together into 2 panels that have our geese formation blocks and then our skein blocks. So I'm going to start with the first panel that we worked on. You'll notice that my formation block is in the upper left-hand corner and my flying geese are pointing to the upper right. I'm going to take 2 of my wind blocks and we are going to sew these on. The first one is going to get sewn on this right angle, right here, like so. And I'm going to sew it along this edge. And then the other one is going to get sewn along the angle near the bottom here. So essentially what we're doing is we're making one large triangle. I'm going to do that, and then I will show you guys what that looks like.
Okay, everybody, I have just switched positions here so you can see what's on my floor. You will see right here that I've got the geese formation block in the upper left-hand corner with the geese pointing towards the upper right. We've got our skein blocks in the middle, and then I've just added the 2 wind blocks to make this upper left quadrant of the quilt. I'm going to go ahead and follow the next set of directions, which is step number 7. Still step number 7, but instead of doing the upper quadrant, we're going to be doing the lower quadrant. So use the other panel, add the other 2 wind blocks, and I'll meet you right back here. Okay guys, I have gone ahead and I have my other panel here too that I just sewed together, but I am not gonna lay that on the floor because I'm running out of room here in my sewing space. What I've done is I've taken my first panel, which is the upper quadrant, I put it on the floor, and I've laid out a tape measure across the hypotenuse or the longest edge. What I'm doing is I am measuring from this corner all the way up to, where am I? To this corner, which on my quilt is 71 inches. We all sew differently. Your measurement may be slightly different, which is okay. But I have 71 inches. I'm going to add 10 inches to that for a total of 81 inches. So now I need to go to my fabric G, which I have not cut this piece yet, and neither have you. We are going to cut 4-inch strips and sew them together until we get a piece that is 81 inches long. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew it on so that I have 5 inches extra hanging off on each side. So I'll leave a 5-inch tail, sew, leave a 5-inch tail. And then we'll go to the next step after this, after you get that far. So measure your quilt, add 10 inches, cut 4-inch strips, and sew them together to this length plus 10 inches. And then we're going to sew that onto this edge of the quilt. And then meet me right back here and we'll move on to the next step.
Okay, we are back at my cutting table. You will notice that I have added my fabric G 4-inch wide strip, and here I have my extra tail. It's lined up with my wind block. What I need to do now is I need to take my ruler. I'm gonna take my larger one, and I need to basically cut this tail off. So I am going to line up my ruler with the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to cut this straight off. That looks about right. Just going to go and take that off. You'll have a little bit of excess left. We just leave the tails so that we can make sure to account for enough length when we go add the middle section over here. So I'm going to do that to both sides of this panel, and then I'm going to do the same thing to the lower quadrant panel, so that we will have basically a larger triangle than we did have because we have this long piece of fabric G on the edge. Okay, so now I have my high altitude panel, and you can tell it's high altitude because you labeled it, right? But if you didn't label it, your flying geese lookalikes, which are really just your half square triangles, are pointing upper right, and they make a corner at the top. So that's this piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the bottom edge of that to the top edge of my low altitude, which does the opposite. It makes a corner. Whoa! It makes a corner at the bottom here with my half square triangles pointing to the upper right. So we're gonna go ahead and sew these two panels together to create one long middle section, which we will then sew between the two. Here on page 29, we will sew between the two triangular panels that we just put together. So you need to sew these two pieces together, and then we're going to sandwich that between our geese formation skein wind blocks. Okay guys, I am here with fabric G, and what I need to do is I need to cut my borders. And you'll notice on page 30 of the instructions, the border, the first border is fabric G. It's 4 inches wide by the width of your quilt. Everybody's is going to be a little bit different just based on how we each naturally sew. So they're 4 inches wide, and I believe you're going to need probably 2 strips for the top and 2 strips for the bottom. So I'm going to cut a total of 4 strips out of this, and then I'm going to do the same thing and cut 4 strips of my fabric F, which is this guy. For some of you, this might end up being a different color. It might be a different patterned print. That's just going to go on the top and the bottom and tie in with the center of your quilt. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut 4 strips that are 4 inches wide from your fabric G. And then we're going to cut 4 strips that are 6 inches wide out of your fabric F or your border fabric. You're going to sew 2 strips together for the top, 2 strips together for the bottom out of each color, and then sew those onto your quilt as I have shown in step 11 on page 30 of the instructions. And then I will show you guys my big reveal here shortly to show you what mine ended up looking like. And I really hope that all of you will share what yours look like on all of my social media channels. Tag me on Instagram at Wilde and Purdy. You can also tag the quilt along. It's hashtag Wilde and Purdy QAL. And then on Facebook, you guys know where to find me. Most of you have been more active on Facebook than on Instagram. But you can show me what you all have made. I'm very excited to see all the color variations. If you post it on my Facebook, I'm probably gonna make a collage out of it so that everybody can see all the different variations all at once, because I think that's gonna be cool. All right, I have these cut. I'm gonna sew these 2 together end to end, and then I'm gonna sew these 2 together end to end, and then I'm gonna do the same thing with my fabric F. I will be right back to show you guys the big reveal.